Hello everyone, I'm Saloni Doshi, the founder and director of Space 118 and your host for today. Welcome to all those who are joining from India and other parts of the world, and thank you so much for your presence today. As many of you already know, Space 118 has been an artist studio and residency space for the past 11 years, supporting over 400 artists from India and all over the world in nearly 30 open studio days. Building on our vision of creating an ecosystem of support and dialogue for Indian and global art practitioners, we are now expanding our role into an independent art grant-making organization that responds to the needs and challenges of today's times. In a similar spirit of deconstructing the current times stands our latest initiative, the On Making series, which is well into its second season now. We launched this series with a simple idea to give audiences a behind the scene perspective into how monumental artworks and exhibitions are made by inviting their artists and curators to take us through their processes. As a residency organizer and an arts patron myself, I have often believed that a landmark victory after putting together a great show is to get a great audience. I'm happy to say that in these 7 weeks and 7 weeks into the series, we have aggregated audiences from across the globe, thanks to the pandemic, since everyone has time, but also through the art pyramid comprising of enthusiasts from veterans to amateurs. Whether they're museum directors or curators or gallerists or even young students, for each person, access has become democratized thanks to the internet in such a way that these fabulous shows are no longer limited to the local audiences who are lucky to live in the cities where they're put up. Thanks to the necessary evil Zoom, we're privileged to get access to these mammoth shows, marvelous speakers, and their insightful journeys. As organizers ourselves, we get a glimpse into the many facets of contemporary art practice and processes. Whether it is the material concerns of those who build, the astuteness of art handlers and space designers who hang these shows, the generosity of institutions and patrons who support these projects, and last but not the least, the vision of the artist and the curator who put together these monumental shows. It has been our pleasure to bring out these very aspects to the audiences, especially at a time when physically going for any of these shows is out of bounds for many of us. Today, we're pleased to have with us a curator who has championed the cause of South Asian artists across the globe, Nada Raza. Based in Dubai at present, Nada is currently working as a curatorial advisor for the Alserkal Arts Foundation and is pursuing her doctoral thesis at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She has recently executed an exhibition of the Moroccan modernist Mohammed Malehi, curated by Zaman Books at the Concrete in Alserkal. Nada was a research curator at the Tate Research Centre with a particular focus on South Asia in the transnational context. She brought works from South Asia into the collection of the Tate and curated the iconic exhibition on Bhupen Khakhar, You Can't Please All. Nada was also the founding artistic director of the Ishara Art Foundation, where in 2019, she curated the two-person show Altered Inheritance, Home is a Foreign Place, with Shilpa Gupta and Zarina Hashmi, which she will speak about today, and both these artists need no introduction. She also curated the show Bodybuilding, a thematic exhibition of lens-based artworks. The Ishara Art Foundation was opened in Dubai in March 2018 by Smita Prabhakar, who is an entrepreneur, art collector, and a long-term Dubai resident. The foundation is now led by Sabi Ahmed and is focused on contemporary art from a South Asian context, supporting cultural exchange and building on shared histories, the continued presence and the cultural contribution of South Asian voices in the Gulf region. The exhibition Altered Inheritance, Home is a Foreign Place, was a special one for me personally, as the display not only became a powerful depiction of each of the two artists' individual mediums, but also an ongoing conversation between their shared concerns and poetic journeys. The words on each of the 36 monochrome woodcuts are triggers for memory in Zirina's Home is a Foreign Place, expressing a quiet yearning for a home she could not return to. The show also displays the tasbih, the prayer beads, which highlighted the spiritual temporalities that much of Zarina's life was dedicated to exploring. Accentuating this dialogue are Shilpa Gupta's works Unnoticed and 10 and 100 hand-drawn maps of my country, where she references the sky and is constantly canvassing ideas over border politics and belonging. These works are permeated with an irony that challenges socioeconomic and cultural constraints. Both these artists' conceptual approaches echo each other in their leaning towards metaphor and illusion, visual restraint, and in their choices of materials such as string, cloth, paper, and gold. While Zarina's imagery remains abstract, Shilpa's work relates more directly to contested territories, informal economies, and clandestine crossings, specifically in her work, Drawings Made in the Dark. Together, they suggest that while borders can tear apart and separate, yet there is an imaginative world beyond. The architectural staging of this two-person exhibition is inspired by the floor plan of Zarina's childhood home, creating intimate spaces for most of the 40 works presented in both a formal and conceptual affinity. Without speaking much, I shall let Lada take us through this journey of putting up this poetic show, which I had the fortune to see in 2019. And I would also like to introduce Falguni Guliani, who is the Space 118 contemporary art writer in residence and the moderator for today's Q&A session that will follow Nada's presentation. So welcome all, and over to you, Nada.
Thank you so much, Saloni, Falguni, and the Space 118 team, the people that you can't see. And thank you also to everybody who's listening. It's really great to be here. I'm seeing the names of some of the listeners, and I wish I could see you all, and I wish we were all in the same room. And it's a real pleasure to be invited to look back at a project that I did last year. And I've been struck in looking back at it that it seems like ages ago, just because this year has been so strange. And so much has happened. And I think the show was coming from, or was made for a time that already seems really long ago somehow, not just because it was addressing a certain kind of politics, and where we are today is just such a harsher and more alienating time. Regardless, I am going to use this opportunity to sort of reminisce about the show and introduce those of you who weren't able to visit it to what it felt like physically. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see the presentation? Is it working okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just as a way of introduction to kind of show you how I got to being in Dubai and curating this exhibition, as Saloni mentioned in her introduction, I had been working at the Tate for a few years before I came to Dubai. And there I was bringing works by South Asian artists into the collection, and here are a few images of some of the works that were displayed while I was there. And we were really looking at the modern and contemporary. It started really in 2012 when Tate decided to establish the South Asian Acquisitions Committee. And I started there as assistant curator and worked with a lot of my contemporaries and peers and elders to really come up with a framework for the acquisitions and how these would complicate and speak to the collection at the Tate. Alongside this, I also got the opportunity to work on the Bhupen Khakhar exhibition with Krista Con. You Can't Please All was in 2016 at the Tate Modern. And that for me was an amazing opportunity to learn more about the Baroda school, and I guess a period that now again feels really important in terms of the 70s and 80s in India. One of the great things about working at the Tate was, or being in London, was that I was able to be South Asian. And I think this is important to say because I realize now, having been in Dubai for the last year or so, that this idea of South Asia only exists outside South Asia. And I'm sort of still figuring out exactly what that means, but Dubai really is, as I call it, expanded South Asia. It's a South Asian city. It's got a very large South Asian population. You can't really be outside of it. Whereas while I was in London, my sort of playing field was much wider. I was looking at India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and was really able to travel much more freely between these countries, which was, now that I look back, quite amazing. The image on the screen now is from the Story of the Missing One, which was a show that I curated in Dhaka for the Dhaka Art Summit, which went to Oka in Norway. And the reason I'm showing these exhibitions is to say that while I was working for an institution, the sort of opportunities I got were either to work on monographic exhibitions or on group shows. And what was interesting about the show I was able to do at Ishara was to work with a two-person format, which is something I'd really wanted to do for a long time, and which became possible because of the circumstances when I arrived here. So I'm going to jump into the exhibition I've been invited to speak about, Altered Inheritances, Home as a Foreign Place, which brought together the work of Shilpa Gupta and Zarina Hashmi. It was an intergenerational conversation between two Indian artists, both women, and both of whose practices I had followed very closely over a long period of time. I was very lucky that when I arrived here to work with Smita at the Ishara Art Foundation, she had been collecting Zirina in depth. And so, and because this was the inaugural show for the foundation, and because I was curating it in a kind of amazingly short period of time, I really had to rely on the collection. And I was very lucky to have these works. And with Shilpa, it's an artist that the foundation was very interested in. There was one very substantial work in the show. And I will also reference here the exhibition, My East is Your West, which was produced by the Gujral Foundation in Venice with Natasha Jinwala. And a lot of the work that was in this show were actually works that I had seen at that exhibition. So just to reference that, in our practice and our methodologies, we are always looking at what has come before and acknowledging and citing those shows. The exhibition, as Saloni mentioned, was based on the idea of this, or the architectural conceit in the show was based on the architecture of Zarina's childhood home, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But that also kind of set the pace of the show. So, so we opened really at the threshold of the house, which set up the relationship between these two key works that also gave the exhibition its title, Altered Inheritance and Altered Inheritances, 100 Last Name Stories by Shilpa, and Zarina's Home as a Foreign Place, which is a set of prints, and we'll look at images of both of these in a second. To give you a sense of the Ishara space, which is at Alserkal Avenue in Dubai's industrial area of Al Quoz. It's a warehouse space. This was the first show in the space, so we had literally, the paint wasn't quite dry, the lighting was brand new. We were still learning the dimensions of the space and how to work with it. And so the view that you're seeing is as you come in, and it's literally the sort of foyer of the gallery. And so the first work you encountered when you walked in was Altered Inheritances, which is these series of photographs, which are photographs and images, and they're layered with text, which are sort of hung in a straight line at eye level, and then as you get closer to the work, you realize that they've been spliced in half. And I think I have a close-up that I'll show you in a second. And each of these images has a text which corresponds to the personal story of an individual. These are political exiles, people who have fled persecution. The stories are both historic and contemporary, but also people who have changed their names in order to seek their fortune. So, you know, movie stars, rock stars, people like David Bowie, but also people who have, you know, sort of left something behind. And I think that was the reason that this work made sense for me in this context. One of the real concerns for me when curating the first show at the Ishara Art Foundation was to really speak to the condition of being South Asian in the Gulf. And I for those of you who are familiar with it, you'll know that, you know, the kind of story of migration or temporary migration from South Asia to the Gulf has been one that is really seen in economic terms. And that often leaves out the more sort of personal and emotional side of the story. And many people come here seeking a better life, you know, in this kind of true capitalist dream style. And it was really important for me to acknowledge that and speak to that in the inaugural exhibition. And I felt like Shilpa's work, for that reason, really resonated. And as I mentioned, what's interesting about the piece is this kind of clean break that forces the eye to sort of travel back and forth in time and sort of work hard to make sense of the complete image, but also gives you that sense of both moving forward and also leaving something behind. And this was in direct conversation with Zarina's Home as a Foreign Place. Home as a Foreign Place, as Saloni mentioned, is a set of 36 woodcuts, each of which has a what Zarina used to call an image idea, really taken from a vocabulary that she had developed, which was quite minimalist. But each image also includes a line of Urdu text underneath it, which describes, I guess, the mood of the work. And the first one, and you know, they range, and I won't get into the whole piece because we don't have enough time, but they range from ideas like Vehshat for despair, a garland of motia, which is khushbu, things that you would really relate to if you're from the subcontinent. And what's special about this piece is that you can relate to it as a sort of, you know, minimalist hieroglyphics if you don't understand the words, but it really opens itself up to you if you can read the Urdu. So the first piece in the set is Ghar, which is the floor plan of Zarina's father's house in Aligarh, which is a home that she spoke about and used a lot. She used this image or this diagram a lot in her work. We didn't get into in-depth introductions of both artists, so I'll do it sort of as we go, because I think those kind of engagements with their life experience was kind of important to this show. But Zarina was born in Aligarh. She passed away last year in London. She lived most of her life in New York, and she maintained her connections and her career in India. And she had a complicated relationship with India in her later years. And in New York, she really found, I guess, kindred spirits in the poets and artists and writers of exile. And her work had a very sort of deep commitment to those poetics and aesthetics. And she often titled her work with fragments of poems, both contemporary and older. And so as I go through and talk about the works, that will come up. But one of the things I was very conscious of also while curating the show was this real interest in poetry in both Zarina and Shilpa's work, and that really helped me bring the show together. And you may have noticed at the beginning that there was a fragment of a poem from Agha Shahid Ali. So for each of the sections, I chose to reference a South Asian poet whose work I thought related to the mood of that section. Coming back to Zarina's father's house, the exhibition floor plan, and you can see a kind of early drawing when we were sketching this out here, recreated the form of the house. So once you cross the threshold into the angan or the courtyard, you were really, as a visitor, inhabiting that space. And that spatial sort of experience, both as you moved through the space and what you were listening to and how you were experiencing the works, was something that was really important to me as a staging or scenography. So as I mentioned, you entered next into the courtyard, and this is where the kind of play in establishing formal relationships between the works really began. You know, I think by this point, Zarina Appa was already quite unwell, and I think one of the things I'm very happy about is that I was able to make a show with her in her lifetime. But one of the great sadnesses is that she was progressively so unwell that I wasn't able to have the kind of dialogue with her that I would have liked. But I did have that dialogue with Shilpa. And it was interesting because when I first invited Shilpa to be part of a two-person exhibition, she expressed some hesitation because you know, it wasn't immediately clear what I was trying to do here. But I'm pleased to say that once we started working on the show and I started bringing these works together, she was exceptionally supportive and sort of really enjoyed these juxtapositions. So in this image, you can see the sort of slightly higher view and how this floor plan was manifest in the space. The first work in this section was Homes I Made, A Life in 9 Lines, in conversation with Shilpa's A0 to A5. And here, you know, both of their sort of, I guess, minimalist approach is the best way of putting it. Their ability to really pare information down to very, very simple lines, but still have some kind of, you know, narrative expression really comes through. So A Life in 9 Lines is floor plans of the homes, all of the homes that Zarina had lived in. And A0 to A5, sorry, I need to just click on the right screen. And A0 to A5 is textile from Fulia, which has been embroidered with a black line that runs through the center, almost like a horizon line. And then and each of those, the length of each of those lines corresponds to a length of the India-Bangladesh border and is expressed as a ratio. And this was, again, the line of that horizon continued through the space into Zarina's Santa Cruz, which was a series of etchings that Zarina made, which were looking at the relationship between the sea and the sky when she was in California and feeling really isolated. And in this work, there is a line from Faiz Ahmed Faiz, which is sort of expressing for her that desolation and loneliness. And here are some individual images of those works. In the corner, a sculpture by Zarina, Homes I Made, and these are terracotta and metal homes. Those of you who are familiar with Zarina's work will be familiar with that sculptural form of the house on wheels that she kept returning to. And this is a really beautiful piece, and again, I'm very happy to say was already in the collection. And now we come to the house itself. And so in the 6 rooms of the house, which was really the heart of the show, this formal as well as conceptual play between the two artists, the actual kind of conversation continued. And what was really, I suppose, and I was telling Saloni this while we were talking about methodology, is that I worked really intuitively on this exhibition. I think because I moved here in November and the show opened in March. I think, I had to really draw upon my own personal resources and things that meant a lot to me. And while I was working on the show, I was reading from a book of poems by Zarina, and I found one that for me spoke so directly to Zarina's directions to my house. And I translated the poem, and that became something that I was reading and thinking about during the process of curating the show. And the Zarina poem is about her visiting her childhood home in Hyderabad, Dhaka. So she's a Pakistani poet. She lives and works in Karachi. But I was very struck by the, I suppose, sentiment of both these texts and brought them together in the exhibition. So in the heart of the house, right at the center of it, and I mentioned sound when I was talking about the scenography, was a video called Home Zarina 2012 by the artist Sophie Ernst. And this was actually a work in the exhibition Lines of Control that I'd worked on while I was at Green Cardamom. And it's an interview with Zarina where she is drawing out the floor plan of her house based on that print. And the final projection for Lines of Control was actually projected onto an actual scale model of the house. But Sophie very kindly agreed to let me show the actual video. And I guess a nice anecdote here is that the video was shot in my father's house because they were in Karachi needing to make this work, and my brother was available to shoot it, and it just so happened that it was in my living room, which again, kind of was a nice layering for me, and it also brought Zarina's voice into the exhibition. So when you walked in through the threshold, through the courtyard, you were drawn in by the sound of her voice talking about, the house in Aligarh, her returning to it. The family leaving it at partition, they're going back, they're subsequently leaving again. And then, I guess early commentary on how things were changing and how her relationship to India was starting to change. And here's a close-up. So as she draws the lines of the house using old photographs, these recollections are made. I'll go through each of the rooms of the house very quickly because I'm conscious of time. But in each of these rooms, there was a conversation between the two artists. So we had the Tasbih, which Saloni had mentioned, which is a really iconic sculptural work of these enlarged prayer beads by Zarina. Shilpa Gupta's wristwatch hands, which are these, the mechanisms of watches pinned onto felt, which really are sort of arresting time. And the third piece in here, I don't have a close-up of that, are these collages by Zarina called Return to the Beginning. And she started collaging at a point where she was conscious that she was running out of time. So these are using materials left over in her studio, and they function sort of as tally marks. This juxtaposition is between Zarina's Beyond the Stars and Shilpa's Untitled, which is a work, as I've mentioned, that I'd seen in Venice. And Shilpa's work looks at the lights it's a pinhole drawing of the lights that delineate the Indian border, which is so bright at night that it can be seen from outer space. So that's that kind of very zoomed out aerial view. There you get a sense of the work. So it's backlit and very difficult to install, but I think we managed with a lot of help from Shilpa. and Zarina Appa's Beyond the Stars, which is based on a line from Iqbal, which is Sitaron se aage jahan aur bhi hai. So, you know, more cosmic and talking about the world beyond. And I should mention here that, you know, I've talked about Zarina Appa's use of poetry, but this show happened soon after, or around the time actually, of the debut of Shilpa's work, which used the poems of 100 poets, and that showed at the Venice Biennial. And so this sort of interest in poetry and in the poetry of resistance in particular was mutual. So while we couldn't show that work here, we did reference that exhibition and that body of work. And you see that in the work Untitled 2018, which is the poems being spoken into these glass bottles, which are then sealed. So here again, sort of very tight juxtaposition between a work by Shilpa, which traces gold being smuggled across the eastern border, and talks about how the person smuggling the gold can only sleep when he's finally safely on the train on this long and arduous journey. And that's shown next to Zarina Appa's Golden Route, 1982, which is a really minimalist Zen artwork, but also around the time that she started to use gold as a material. So you see the work Coin by Zirina, which is one of her paper pulps, but this time covered in gold leaf. And I've heard from others that, you know, Zarina Appa had always worked in this monochromatic palette, but when, as an artist, she was able to afford material, she worked a lot with gold leaf. And this body of work appeared in the exhibition Noor. And Coin is this sort of incredibly beautifully textured sculpture. One of the things about these paper sculptures was that they belied their weight. So even though they're cast and they look like they might be, I guess, more, might be heavier materials, things like stone or gold or metal or clay, they're actually paper. And this was next to Shilpa's Liquid the Mouth Froze, which was a piece, and there's a text piece that accompanies this cast of the inside of a mouth. And the text talks about a disappearance, so a person who has been sort of disappeared off the street. And of course, this is referencing the type of responses to dissent, which, and as I said, you know, last year already seemed so much more innocent compared to South Asia. And that just continues, but there was a sort of sideways reference to that in the show. Mapping and lines, again, are something that are quite important to both artists. And so as you kind of come around the house, and there's a section, and I'll come to that in a second. So another room dealt with minimalism in both practices, specifically works made using only paper and string, so very early reliefs by Zarina, which are really minimal kind of exercises and play with paper and other materials. But then Shilpa's work, Spool, which is based again on a kind of unfurled, deconstructed Jamdani sari from Bangladesh, and then also works that she'd made around the trees that grow in more than one country and are contested, but they're, and I don't have a close-up, I'm afraid, but are claimed by more than one nation. And the last room in this sequence dealt with text or the obfuscation of text. So Zarina's Few Steps in the Land of Confucius, which is a rubbing which looks like it could be the pages of a text, but it's not clear whether they are blank pages or erased pages. And Shilpa's work, Nothing Will Go on Record, which is a text piece talking about a skirmish by the border security forces, but the text has been redacted from the piece. It was in this section that I had put Zarina's letters, which she has collaged, including directions to my house, which was the kind of closing piece in this section. And then the sort of outer boundary of the house became the section that dealt with mapping in both of the practices. And here we had Shilpa's map tracing. So wherever an exhibition is made, Shilpa will do a site-specific piece dealing with the national boundaries of that geographic region. So she specially made a copper pipe tracing of the map of the UAE for our exhibition. In the distance, you see Zarina Appa's Travels with Rani, which is a sort of map of undivided India based on the travels with her sister Rani to all the different train stations. One of my favorite pieces. A work again titled after both Adrian Rich and Ghalib, Atlas of My World. Sorry, These Cities Blotted into the Wilderness. Atlas of My World is next. These are cities that I guess were associated with Islamic civilizations that have been centers of violence, places like Sarajevo, Kabul, Beirut. I suppose Beirut could be in here twice really. But it ends with New York with the kind of very stark image of the Twin Towers. And it was at this point, I think, as a resident of New York, that she sort of started thinking and talking a lot more publicly about what it meant to be a Muslim woman, and what sort of burden that put on being on her identity as an artist. This was juxtaposed with Shilpa's 100 hand-drawn maps of my country, and this is a carbon tracing of a work that was made over a period of time, inviting 100 individuals to freehand draw the border of India, and you can see sort of the immense variation in those lines. And the last work you see here is Atlas of My World, which are maps of the different regions that Zirina has belonged to. But the one that really stands out, of course, is the border between India and Pakistan. And then the last section of the show, which is really the roof of the house. And you go upstairs into a much more contemplative space, with these references to the sky. And I'm going to leave you with the text for a second. And here I was very conscious of sort of creating a certain mood. And as I said before, this show really came from within somehow. And one of the things that's been my experience in terms of dealing with borders is that while I worked on exhibitions like Lines of Control, there was a lot of attention to storytelling, to works that somehow either commemorated or described or memorialized or critiqued or resisted somehow, or sometimes even celebrated, I guess, the nation state in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that's fine, but I always found it difficult that there was no place to express the emotional weight of having lived through those kinds of divisions. And I think that's what this exhibition was really trying to do. And so upstairs, you had really two works directly opposite each other, which was Shilpa's Unnoticed 2017, which is a series of these, I'll come back to that actually, because of the order of my presentation, sorry about that. So Unnoticed and Zarina's Crawling House, which is a series of these 500 metal or tin winged creatures, these winged houses. And it's that form that she's always worked with of the house on wheels, but here it's been opened up. And they look like these slightly menacing insects or birds. And to those of us who are familiar with the imagery of, or photography of the partition and of the kind of photographs of migrants on bullock carts crossing the border, of course, it brings back that sort of swarm. But you know, again, it's an abstract and open piece, which could be a virus, it could be a flock of flying birds, it could be insects. It's sort of left open. Shilpa's Unnoticed 2017, which are sea prints, photographs taken on the India-Bangladesh border. And these are sculptural. They are these metal pieces which are stuck onto the surface. And these are car parts that were actually smuggled across the border. And what she told me is that they kind of dismantle these cars and motorcycles, carry them across bit by bit, and then they get reassembled on the other side. And we can talk more maybe about the Q&A, about the context of some of these works by Shilpa and the geography where she was working. And it was interesting because when I saw these works, immediately I thought about something exploded or something violent. And it was interesting to find out that actually it was something much more abstract. And the final work in the show was Shilpa Gupta's Speaking Wall. Again, you know, downstairs you had Zarina's voice, and upstairs you had Shilpa's. But here is a piece that you can only experience alone, and the audience is invited to stand on the line of bricks and put on the headphones and follow a set of instructions, which are in Shilpa's voice. And this work is, you know, I guess, one that for me was a nice way to end this exhibition. It's a moment of meditation almost, where you listen to the artist who asks you to step forward and step back, and you're not quite sure what you're being asked to do. And then the text sort of expands and tells you that there's and you know, you have the impression that there's a voice behind the wall that's calling you in, but you realize that meeting that voice is an impossibility. And it tells you that the border that you thought you were about to cross, which was, you know, may have been close the night before, has washed away, and that you will never be able to cross it. And this was, I think, one of the most powerful works in the exhibition. I want to talk a little bit before I close about the programming and the reception to the exhibition, and again, why it was meaningful to make this show, particularly in the context of Dubai. So, of course, we did the usual curator-led tours. We had Shilpa with us for a tour with her. But then I invited the writer, sometimes curator, and editor, Saira Ansari, to respond to the exhibition, and she made a tour based on her own interest in, I guess, the politics and poetics of exile, and particularly Urdu, and particularly her relationship to Lahore, and particularly, I guess, the way in which she has dealt with loss, which was a really sort of powerful way of activating that space. We also did a workshop where we asked participants to bring either a photograph or a drawing of a home that they had left behind. And that was actually extraordinary because, you know, I've spoken about the South Asian expat, as we're called, experience of being in the Gulf. But that workshop opened up how universal that experience is. And we had participants from Iraq, from Iran, from Syria, from Lebanon, I mean, you name it, you know. And it became this sort of group, you know, therapy of sorts, where people talked about either their childhood homes, homes lost to war, homes lost to, we don't talk often enough about homes lost to urban development and to capital, but, you know, almost all of us have a childhood home whose floor plan we have memorized that we'll never be able to go back to. And that really became, and it was also interesting in that to see this attention both in Sayara's talk and in the workshop, and in Zarina's work. And I mentioned trees and shilpas, not just to the house, but also to the plants that grew in it. As if gardening and sort of planting trees is somehow also, literally related to these ideas of rootedness, and what you leave behind and what you look for if you're able to return. How much bigger is the tree now, which I thought was really quite beautiful. I've been working with these ideas of permanent temporariness, as Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petty call it. And of course, looking at the sort of poetics and stories of movement and exile in this show, it already feels somehow gentler and off the last century, because I think the experience of movement and migration that we're seeing now is I guess, so much more harrowing and so much more violent. But I guess I will close here and open it up to questions. Did I do okay for time, Falguni?
Yes, you were perfect. Thank you, Nada. And thank you really for taking us through that, wonderfully poetic exhibition led across so many scales, not just the local and the extraterrestrial, but also it's an exhibition which is as much about homes and belonging as it is about the kind of deeply exilic space that comes from loss. So as I start taking questions from the audience, we've got a lot already. I'll start with going back to the basics almost, because I think to start at the beginning and work our way from there really helps us situate where your curatorial practice is today and the kind of focus you put on methodology and form above, say, easier, I don't want to say lower hanging fruits, but slightly more accessible matters of representation and identity, which can so easily become misnomers for what one stands for. So how important has it been for you, Nada, to take this academic route? Because your entry into the art world was through the lens of critical theory, your work at the Tate Research Centre. So and I think as a follow-up from that, how important is it, do you think, for curators today to have this kind of art historical know-how in their bag of tricks? And if I can take it from there into just another level, how much of your relationship to curating now would you say is also about acknowledging what lies outside the realms of that criticality? Something that's a deeper knowledge, which is more visceral, and embracing the thing that you cannot know.
Thanks for the question. I think, for me, it's been a process of working backwards always. And so I came to curating really working with contemporary artists, working with my peers. And it was through being at the Tate and having to learn what it means to be a collections curator, which really required you to be able to make relationships between works. One of the pressures on us, and of course, we were kind of divided by those very typical post-Enlightenment area studies model of, Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and so on and so forth. But it was amazing to be in the same room with all of those curators and sort of have a collective mission of, decolonizing the canon as the, I guess, bigger picture was. But of course, that was, incredibly difficult to do with a collection that was dominated by, I guess, not just modern art, but a very particular kind of painting, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's where I think for me, the first encounter with art history was not a pleasant one, right? It was an agonistic one.
Right.
Like, this is the house that you have to break down. But I think I'm someone who's really interested, I'm deeply interested in form and in making and in being in the studio and, you know, understanding studio practices. And so, and it's something I question actually now, because I feel, you know, especially in these times of being dematerialized ourselves and not being able to necessarily go to shows or to be making shows that you feel that the people who really should see them won't be able to see, you know. You have to kind of reconsider your relationship to the object, and some of us love them even more and some of us are willing to leave them behind. I don't think it should be either way, but I think it's been really interesting for me to be pursuing academic research, and I think there is a move to working more transhistorically. I'm not the only one. But as I said, you know, while being in England, there's this idea of South Asia that you can kind of play along with. But things like being, you know, even before none of us could travel, I had to deal with restrictions in my travel. You know, visas have just become much more difficult. And so the way for me to kind of deal with that is to go back to what I can do somehow. And my research has become much narrower and much more historical. And I can't say that it's a methodology as such, but it's allowing me to do the learning that I didn't start out with, in terms of, you know, a kind of more well-rounded historical knowledge of South Asia, not just what's in our syllabuses and textbooks, but particularly pre-colonial South Asia. So I don't know where that's going to lead me, as in, you know, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. So on that note of waiting and seeing, and before we really dive into the deep end, I want to talk about something you mentioned at the end of your presentation, but we didn't get enough time to get into it. And it's about the work that makes up the title, well, half the title of this exhibition. And it's the work that viewers see, as you said, right when they enter the Ishara building, which is Shilpa's Altered Inheritance. And, you know, there is, of course, in that work, a movement and, you know, an allusion to movement across borders. But there's also a very formal and, dare we say, a dispassionate splicing that happens in it, you know. And if we focus on the brutality of that form, how do you see this kind of brutal form changing and evolving with the increasingly brutal times that we have ahead of us, as you pointed out, with migrations getting all the more harrowing due to climate change? I mean, COVID is possibly the first one of our, you know, ecological pandemics that we're seeing. So just in terms of brutality and form, where are your thoughts and how do you see this going forward?
I think the sort of, you know, even though there is a violence in Shilpa's work, it's a controlled violence, right? It's a precise incision. So I guess, you know, for me, it's more about time rather than pain, if that makes any sense. And actually, when you start reading the stories or the text within it, and it's been a little while now, so I don't have them memorized anymore. But the tempo of you know, the tonality of the stories keeps changing, right? So while some of them are about, you know, the Holocaust or about families fleeing Bombay after you know, terrorist attacks, or I guess you know, as I've mentioned, these kind of individual stories of normally of some kind of ethnic discrimination, by which you might want to simplify your name. I feel like social violence isn't always kind of due to conflict, shall we say. And that's what I meant, that, when we think about people being, having to leave their homes, right? We forget that there are also banal reasons why that happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And so that kind of cleft can be due to something as simple as we can't afford to live here anymore. Which something that I think our generation especially, even those of us who were lucky enough to have been born into stability are having to deal with extremely uncertain futures, right? And I don't know if you've read Rob Nixon's Slow Violence. It's a very popular text at the moment. But I feel like that work has that element also somehow in it.
Yeah. So, on that note of slow violence, from going there into not about pain, but about time, which is what you said at the beginning, there's a question that I always ask curators in this series. It's about exhibition design and spatial structuring. But in your case, I want to bring the attention back to what we started with, which is, this almost architectural sleight of hand, which you have in your exhibition design, where the floor plan mirrors Zarina's woodcuts in a way. So when the viewer moves through it, it gives them this very bodily sensation of being ensconced in an artwork. Can you talk a bit about this kind of multi-layered, this multi-pronged layering that you do so consciously in the exhibition? It's not just in terms of architecture, but it's also, as you said, in terms of poetry. And before I go on, I just want to remind our viewers here that Bose Krishnamachari has left a comment in the chat that Shilpa's Jailed Poet Poems was actually first shown at the Kochi Biennale prior to the Venice Biennial. So I just thought I'll bring that in because we're talking about the layering that you do through poetry and infusing your exhibition with a kind of a literary sensibility, which, as Bose pointed out, as you pointed out, is something both artists do, Shilpa and Zarina. So when you're distilling these things of space and architecture and poetry together, how much of, would you say, your job as a curator is to curate a poetics of space, if I can borrow from that very famous book, and not just a show?
I'm going to say thank you to Bose for reminding me of that. But actually, that work was first shown in Edinburgh, I think, which is where
okay.
Right? So if you're going to be,
chicken and egg.
It can take a while. But I actually, it was. I think we were having discussions around showing the work, and it was to be shown in Kochi and to be shown in Venice around the time that I was curating the shows. That's why the reference to Venice. And I think, again, it was one of those works that you really have to experience. There's just no documentation that can describe it, because it's a sound and sculptural work, and really powerful. But coming back to staging, I think, intimacy, I suppose, is the word I would use. That was very important in this exhibition, to create the intimacy between these two artists. To, the works that I chose are deliberately quite restrained, I guess, and it was really that relationship also between them in terms of distilling ideas down into line that I was attracted to, right? And there are, of course, many incredible abstract artists who have done amazing things with form in South Asia. But what's interesting about both of these artists, like I said, is that there is still a story. It's not pure abstraction. There is still a narrative, despite the sort of adoption of this abstract idiom. And I wanted people to get really close for that reason, to kind of intensify the depth of the conversation, but also then isolate those works so that you could encounter them almost one at a time. So it was about the pacing through the show. It was about really bringing you outside of, so Alserkal is a warehouse district. It's full of fantastic galleries. They're fantastic, they're really beautiful spaces. So you get that experience of seeing great work on white walls and the white cube experience throughout. So how do we make Ishara then different, right? How do we kind of help people enter a different world, a more sort of a world where they might spend a lot more time. So that I think that sort of maze also encouraged people to linger.
Yeah, I think that when you say that intimacy is the key word, that really answers one of the audience questions that I have from Riya Kumar, who said, "Do you think that the use of abstraction accentuates or takes away from the idea of the local?" So in a way, what you say answers that. And I want to take our conversation again in the direction of poetry, because we're on this subject here. And for those of our audiences who don't know, Nada shared this beautiful anecdote with us earlier on in our curatorial call, where she said that, she found the Zarina poem one afternoon on a beach, and she translated it, and there it was, this kind of entry point into the show, presenting itself to her. So, on the topic of poetry and the many wondrous ways that it finds us, whether it's an afternoon at the beach or elsewhere, I want to share with you, Nada, that another poem which we spoke about in our call, which is Philip Larkin's Home is So Sad. And the reason is that there's a line in there where he's talking about visiting his parents' house long after they've passed. And he references the music of a long forgotten piano stool and a lone vase that sits, possibly on the piano or a mantelpiece. It doesn't specify. But, when we were talking, it reminded me so much of Zarina's poem, which we also just saw in your slide. And it's, the particular line in it about familiar doors being silent. Now, there is, of course, a shared love for poetry in all of us here, but I think there's something in that sentence about familiar doors being silent, about the music of piano stools, which really gets to the heart of what your exhibition is about. Because it's not about borders, it's not about homes, it's not about identities of being a Muslim artist. It's about something quite simple and primordial, really. The physicality of loss that emerges from the inability of seeing people that you love. And though that's a deeply feminist space in the works of these artists, it's also a space that today we know too well because of COVID and being confined to our homes and the inability of travel. So within that inability, there is this kind of coming and going, and that's what I want to focus on today. When you put a Zarina and Zarina Hashmi together, how do you deal with this tussle, which is between an acknowledgement of departure, which Zara does, which say even Shilpa does in her work, and a constant recurrence to departure, which, the memories of Zarina do. And would you say that this kind of a tussle speaks also to the struggle of putting two intergenerational artists, icons almost, together?
Like I said, I had to sort of persevere to make that happen, right? and then stand vindicated at the end when it was done. But I have to admit, I really dreamt this show up in like less than a month. I didn't have time to think about it so much. It just sort of, and that's how my writing is too, which is why working on a PhD is the most difficult thing I've ever done. I will think about things and then they will just come out fully formed, right? And so in terms of the poetry, I think it's for me the kind of go-to thing when I'm out of ideas, right? It's a way of reading around things. It's a way of going back to, the ability to be able to think with and from experience somehow. And I think actually, I mean, if you think about it, Zara Khala and Zarina are, have the same aesthetic sensibility. They're sort of writing, Urdu. The Urdu language is something, and I guess the poetics of the subcontinent, and I guess the commitment to language is something that they are really, rooted in. And I think I find now, and obviously, Faiz is a really important poet. He was very important to Zarina. She talked about him a lot. And the current exhibition at Ishara is starting again from a Faiz poem. So I'm not alone, I think, in having that sensibility.
Yeah.
But I think there's such amazing female poets in Urdu and Hindi, right? And I think, and there's amazing contemporary poetry being produced. And it will always be, I think, that space where, especially at times of great censorship, right? That becomes a space where you can express yourself, which is really, what Shilpa's work is talking about, is the danger of a space where even that becomes impossible, right? And so I suppose faced with these closures, you then say, okay, how can I curate an exhibition that creates a space for those conversations without shutting anything down? How do I leave it open enough? How do I create a space that's critical and emotional? And I think, one of the things that is also a part of Urdu Shairi, and it can be a little bit sort of wet sometimes, but I think it is part of our DNA, is the lament. It's the dirge, it's the lament, it's the marsiya, it's the, and I'm kind of on the fence with this stuff because I'm a fairly restrained person. So, but I do think that, there are also moments of collective raising of voice, right?
Yeah.
They're about memory and about commemoration and about making sure that injustice is never forgotten. Right? So the word, I'm moving away from image, but the word has that power, right? And so I guess, how do you bring that sensibility to the work of art? How do you build that into a show? And with this exhibition, I wanted people to cry. I thought if people cry, then I've done what I wanted to do. And I'm really happy to say, especially with the last piece, like people would go through the show. The upstairs was this dark, contemplative, almost chapel-like environment, and people did, and I felt like I had, kind of succeeded. It's a really strange thing to say, but it was all my own sort of bottled up grief and frustration, I suppose.
Yeah, there are, on that very personal note, there are some personal messages here in the chat box from Bose and from Rina Kalat that I'll send you the transcript of later, but not reading out.
Right, and I miss you all so much.
Yeah, so, in closing, I want to kind of come full circle here because we started with your relationship to curating, and that's where I want to end too. Because we're talking about a great deal of your own personal associations with the content of this show, I want to focus on a very special word, which you used when we were talking about preparation for this webinar, which is catharsis. And this idea of people crying in the exhibition and the fact that you're, in fact, a very restrained person. So I want to think today, in closing, about the idea of curating as a catharsis and what kind of grain that leaves us with, not only as makers, but also as experiential visitors of an exhibition, you know. And then where does restraint fit into that idea? So for example, I mean, this is an age-old question in the making of art, right? How much of yourself do you give to it? And at what point do you hold back? And if you look at an artist like Zarina, her entire career is spent chiseling this kind of restraint and abstracting from it a kind of, you know, sense of deep loss. So in your case, one might say there are many challenges and constraints that you work with, whether it's the fact that you had virtually a month to put together this show. You were working with a limited collection, a fantastic one, but you only had that at your disposal. Or, you know, whether it's the fact that you're curating this in a location which is under, for the want of a better word, geopolitical surveillance, or even institutional bottlenecks, which you spoke about at the very beginning of your presentation, you know, that you could never do a two-person show at Tate because the format doesn't allow for it. So as a curator, how do you work through these different kinds of challenges, and where does catharsis come in?
I should also really thank Smita Prabhakar for trusting me with Ishara, for, you know, I guess giving me the opportunity to work with the collection, and to really trust me conceptually with what the opening sort of gambit was going to be. I think in terms of how you negotiate constraints, I think, you know, try growing up under martial law. You learn, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that one should do that, but I think, you know, that's something, especially when dealing with Middle Eastern art, actually, with art from, let's say, Iran in particular. You know, let's think about Iranian cinema. You know, I think that's really where the imagination lies, right? Is when there is constraint, for some people at least. And I think, you know, we are so attached to ideas of freedom, whether it be of speech or of expression, being somehow universal. And of course, in real life, that's not the case. Something that you can do in one place, perhaps you can do in another, but you can do something else there, right? And let's be fair, Dubai is a city where I still have my world. Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans and Nepalese can be together here. And that means a lot to me, right? So as a kind of second home or third home, I don't know what to call it. This is, I'm still at home here, right? I still, and it's to the smallest detail, from access to kind of very obscure regional foods, to language, to the people you work with. To be able to work in your language for the first time is really extraordinary. So, you know, it may be that that you have to be a bit, I mean, and, you know, to curate is to take care. So perhaps you have to be a bit more careful. But I think the slate is in still being able to do that work. And so I mentioned the workshop, for instance, and that became a space where people could come and talk about not just having left a home, but being in a home that you know you will have to leave, right? And rather than a criticism, it came out as a, you know, as a lament, as a space of sadness, and nobody can take that away from you. You're still allowed to be sad.
Yeah. So on that note of, you know, that very beautiful line that you just said, that to curate is to care, I can just see the thank yous pouring in. We've got Iftikhar Dadi, Shri Goswami, Nili Nair, everyone who's written a very sweet note of thanks to you that we'll definitely send to you for reading. But if I can just take one final question, and then I think Saloni will jump in for her word of thanks after this, is from, because we're really running out of time, is from Valeria Mrinalini, who's asked, you know, because we were just on this note of, you know, moving from one home to another and moving across countries and living in this sort of it's a cocoon, but it's also an accessible part of your world. I think Valeria's question here is relevant. You know, she says, in your work, displaying, interpreting, and discussing South Asian art in Dubai, in your opinion, has this affected wider discussions on migration in the region?
If Valeria is with us, maybe could you be a bit more specific? Is she allowed to talk?
She can type, but...
Okay. Because wider migration in the region as in more recent migration or?
Yeah. You know, I suppose she means, oh wait, I think I do have, no, that's not a message from her. But I suppose it's, you know, the migration just outside of the South Asian context in Dubai. Yeah.
I mean, as I said, you know, thematically, the show was really open enough to allow for people to relate to it as something that, you know, has a much broader shared affect. And I think, you know, this is really one of those cities where a very, very large part of the population is from elsewhere.
Yeah, she's in fact talking about migrant workers, for example. That's her clarification in the chat box.
Well, that was my next show, which was called Bodybuilding, which was looking specifically at the representation of the South Asian body against the architectural or urban landscape. So perhaps we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, that's a whole different material there. Yeah.
So thank you, Nada, for that wonderful conversation, and thank you, Falguni. I'm sure viewers got a fabulous insight into how a two-person show can have such strong voices coming through the exhibition. Also, you know, both the works, body of works of both the artists are not just aspirational, but about survival in the context of your own Gulf experience. However, for me, what stood out is how the show was about their shared experience of home, displacement, borders, difficult journeys, and memories, which you have so poignantly chronicled. I thank you on behalf of Space 118 and the audience for allowing us to view this show in such a special manner and to learn of your own journey, your own exile, and the non-binary.
Self-imposed.
Your own self-imposed exile, your roots, and the non-binary choices that have helped us understand the South Asian narrative. Thank you for opening up to us, Nada, through the poetic works also of Shilpa and Zarina once again.
And a huge thank you to Shilpa. I don't know if she's listening.
She is listening. She's here. We're back next Sunday with our closing speaker for this series, and she's the last one in the series. She's one of the pioneering artists for the neo-miniature tradition, Shadya Sikandar, who will take us through her decades-long practice and, most importantly, her newly opened solo at the Sean Kelly Gallery in New York. So stay tuned and see you next Sunday. And thank you, Nada, once again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody else. Come visit me in Dubai when you can. Stay safe.